All right, welcome to the Meat Mafia podcast. We have on today Jason Wrich, owner of Wrich Ranches and a regenerative farmer. We are super excited for this one. Jason, how's it going?
Oh, it's going great. It's finally spring and we got rain at our low elevations and snow on the mountains. And that's just exactly how we want it this time of year.
Beautiful. And you're calling in from Colorado, correct?
Yep. Our home ranch is in Crawford, Colorado. And then we lease properties in Hotchkiss, which is a little town about 20 minutes from where we are here as well.
Beautiful. And before we forget here, I'm joined with Mr. Salazzo. Don't want you to quietly get started here. How you doing?
Oh, no worries. Good to see both of you guys. Glad that we're able to do this. We were just having a good little chat. I think this is going to be a great episode.
Well, we know it's going to be a great one because we've done it once before.
Yeah, it's actually a good way to preface it. We were having an amazing conversation. We had some technical difficulties, but that was kind of like the rehearsal for the big game. So Jason, we're expecting big things out of you for this episode.
Yeah, that was like stretching out, getting ready, and now we're ready for the good one.
Well, and that's one thing about living in rural America where your infrastructure is always 5 or 10 years behind all of you guys that live in the city. We don't have all of those modern conveniences like reliable Wi-Fi.
I think that there's a correlation between reliable Wi-Fi and access to good beef. I think I saw a study on that somewhere. So that means your beef must be pretty top notch.
Well, and the cows don't care because they're doing what they do no matter what we're trying to connect to on the computer.
Yeah.
I love it. Well, I think the best place to start is sort of getting a sense for your backstory and your entry into farming. Have you always, I think give the audience a sense of how you got into it. Was it something that was a family, family business, or did you start as a first generation farmer? And, I think that context will sort of get things going.
Sure, absolutely. So I was raised in town. I lived and grew up in the only little subdivision in Hotchkiss, Colorado. But my maternal grandparents have a little farm in Olathe. And that's where I got my introduction to farming and ranching and really the regenerative way of doing things. My grandfather bought a little property that had been completely used up. It had been overplowed and undergrazed, and it was like just really ugly, caliche, tight clay soil. And him having grown up over in the San Luis Valley and having farmed really rough ground and knowing, as a kid growing up, how to take care of it, he just immediately started hauling in biological material and building the soil back up. And within 10 or 15 years, he had the best hay crop of any of his neighbors. And so that's where I got turned on to, like, you can do it different. You don't have to rely on chemicals. You don't have to rely on fertilizers. You don't have to rely on the seed companies. You can do it your own way, the way that they had for forever. And so I used to spend summers with them and help them during haying season and whatnot. We'd milk our own goats and milk their own cows. So they had fresh goat milk and dairy and chickens and hogs and lambs and cows and all of that stuff. They had a little bit of everything, had a huge garden, canned everything. Everything was cooked in either beef tallow or lard. They didn't use any vegetable oils at all. And they all lived into their 90s. Wow. So that was something else that kind of stimulated this in my mind, like their way of living and their way of life. Even though the Surgeon General may not say that that's the way to do it, they had something going on. And of course, part of it's genetics. And so fast forward to, I was about 10 or 12 years old and I wanted to get into livestock. Well, living in town, the only thing that we could have is rabbits. So I started raising rabbits. I raised meat rabbits and wool rabbits, Angoras, for their wool, and marked breeds that we used to show in 4-H. And I even raised chinchillas for a while for their pelts and also for pets, just because they're interesting and you can keep a lot of them in a small space, and they're another totally unique animal. I mean, they have their own way of doing things and you either adapt to them or they just don't do it. And so then I met my wife, and her family owns a cattle ranch. And so I was just like, wow. And so we came out here, and I got to meet my future father-in-law, of course, dating his oldest daughter, first boy ever to be introduced. That was interesting. He was actually in the barn with a cow who had not allowed her calf to suck. And so he was milking this cow out in the barn in the squeeze chute. And just as I walked through the door, the cow kicked the milk bucket over. And so he had a few choice words to say and reared back and punched her in the side. And then my wife, at the time girlfriend, was like, "Hey Dad, this is Jason, the boy I wanted to introduce you to." And I was like, oh my word. Because he was a mountain of a man. I mean, he was like 6'2", 6'3", probably 300 pounds. I mean, he was a big railroad worker, locomotive engineer, and he was a big dude. And he stood up, and I thought, I'm dead. But I stuck to it, and I stuck with it and kind of worked my way in. And I was a free ranch hand. I love the work. I love working on the land, fixing fence, building fence, irrigating, all that stuff. I just fell in love with this place. And then I went off and worked on a fishing boat in Alaska for a summer that I graduated from high school, came back, went to Marine Corps boot camp. My wife and I were married. She traveled with me in the Marine Corps. And when I got out of the Marine Corps, we moved back here, and I went to work in the coal mines. I worked in underground coal mining for 15 years. And by then, my in-laws had sold all their cattle, and they were leasing the home ranch out to a local rancher. And for me, loving the land, I had a really hard time with the way that it was managed. And I just really wanted a chance to make it better. And so I approached them to ask them to cash lease it from them. And they strongly discouraged me because they'd about went broke trying to cattle ranch. And I said, I understand that. I have a good paying job to help subsidize what I'm going to try and do. Just let me take it over. And they agreed. And so I immediately just started working on trying to fix the soil, improve the irrigation infrastructure, doing everything that I could to make it better. And through the things that I'd learned from my grandfather, a lot of sweat equity and not a lot of cash inputs. Like if you pay attention to what you're doing and you put more water on places that need more water, less water on places that need less water. What I found is the alfalfa that we grow on this property is old, super old. Some of these fields haven't been worked since the 50s. So it's way before GMOs, way before they engineer it to wear itself out. I mean, we have deep tap-rooted alfalfa that will self-seed in existing stands. And when I learned that, I would let that hay go to super maturity, cut it, bale it, and then spread it on bare areas, and then let it self-seed, reseed itself without actually purchasing any alfalfa seed. And
Jason,
so
could you break that down for us? Just what all that actually means in terms of the context of, alfalfa, what is that going to do for the soil? I've heard that there's plenty of benefits of using it, but just getting it from, that full understanding from you would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So alfalfa is like the prince of forages. It is a total nutrient forage. And typically modern alfalfa that most people grow is GMO. It's Roundup ready. So you can plant alfalfa and then spray it with glyphosate, and it kills all the weeds. So you have a monocrop, monoculture stand, and it's very predictable on its nutrients. And you can get multiple harvests, especially if you're somewhere where it's really warm, like in Arizona, Texas, places, New Mexico, where they have good irrigation water, where they're pumping it out of the aquifer or out of the Colorado River if they're close to it. And you can get 6, 7, 8 crops oftentimes of that monocrop alfalfa. Alfalfa is a legume, so it's a nitrogen fixer, much like your clovers and those kinds of things as well. And so it's pulling inert nitrogen out of the air and then storing it in little nodules on its roots, which then releases as it goes through its life cycle, as far as going to flower, going to seed, dying back. And so all of the grasses around it can then utilize all of that nitrogen. It's also very deep tap rooted, and so that it can store moisture in its tap root, and then it can also mine for micro and macronutrients in the soil. It has it does a really great job for stabilization of soils also, and it's super high in protein. So as far as growing, finishing cattle, it's a great feed for that. And so most of your modern post about 1970 alfalfas, they start to thin out and die out, usually due to pest problems. And so it's by design. They want you to buy seed every 7 years. So they want you to plow your whole place up and replant it every 7 years. That way they can sell you more seed. Whereas the alfalfa that we're growing, we're working on 70-plus-year-old plants where the roots are as big around as my wrist. And some of them are as long as 7 feet long. I cleared out an area to build a stack yard to stack hay. And when I was digging, there was a alfalfa root on the high side of this bank that I was cutting out. And I went down 6.5 feet and it was still going. So that just goes to show just how deep the taproot on that alfalfa will grow. Another interesting thing with the alfalfa that's on this place is you have all different colors of flowers on these plants. There's everything from a deep dark purple, lighter purple, red, pink, white, cream colored, this huge gamut of colors. And so I called one of my friends that's a seed dealer, and they also grow some alfalfa seed, and asked him, like, what variety of alfalfa do you think this is? And he said, he asked when it was planted or the last time those fields had been worked. And I said, I hear in the 50s. And he said, well, that could be what we would call floor sweepings. We clean alfalfa seed all day, and then all of the seed that falls out of the machines or gets spilled, we just sweep it up, and that's the cheapest seed that you can buy. So oftentimes poor farmers would buy that, and you would plant it, and then through years and years and years of cross-pollination, you never really know what you get, other than we know that it's established crop, and therefore it's acclimated for the terrible droughts that we go through, the livestock pressure, the wildlife pressure, because it's still here and it's still thriving. And so it's like perfectly adapted. So why wouldn't you want that in your pastures? And once we had this conversation, he says, I'd love to come out and look at it, and then maybe we can work together with something on it, which is like, means that you can steal my agricultural seed intelligence and patent it, and then turn around and profit off of the work that we've been doing on this place. Thanks, but no thanks. I'll keep it. Sure, I'll share it with friends. That's one of those things, but that's something that I don't want to take out, and I don't want to have modified or whatever, like so many of the seed dealers have done to other farmers that keep their own seed.
Interesting.
So that's kind of a story on our alfalfa here.
And so you're just distributing that locally and to friends, but you have an objection to selling it to these larger seed distributors?
Correct. And I'm not harvesting seed. What I'm letting it do is letting the hay go to maturity to where it has viable seed in it, and then sharing the hay. So people can place the hay and like do an experiment themselves and see if they can get the benefit from it as well.
Right.
And that's with mixed success, because the best way that I've done it is to feed the hay and let the cows tromp it into the dirt and urinate, and fertilize over the top of it. That's where I've had the best germination success.
Yeah. Jason, something we wanted to ask you, because it's such an interesting story. What, from your perspective, what led you, or what was your driver to go into ranching and regenerative agriculture when it sounds like you had a few other jobs that you could have done? It sounds like you might have known that this was going to be an investment. You didn't know when you were going to make money. What really pulled you towards doing that?
So we sat down and made a 5-year plan.
Mhm.
And 18 months into the 5-year plan, Obama's war on coal worked, and we were regulated out of business, and we sealed the portals in the coal mine. And so at that time, my wife and I sat down and decided, you're either going to ranch full time or you're going to find another job. What do you want to do? And I'm like, baby, you know what I want to do. What can we do to make it work? And so we sat down and we borrowed money to buy more cows, and we went big, you know, and we had a pretty good year as far as irrigation water. And then the very next year was the 2018 drought. And boy, it's a reality check and a wake up call. I mean, luckily we had stored a lot of hay because we'd raised a lot of hay. But we ended up selling cows and taking out another loan to buy hay to feed cows. And at that time, we were only selling a few beeves to friends and family. And selling feeder calves, like most cow calf guys do, is the margins are paper thin. And so that's when I really started looking at the grass-fed, grass-finished, all-natural thing. The reason we went regenerative is because if I'm going to go broke, I'm going to go broke doing the way that I think I should, not supporting the fertilizer company, not supporting the seed company, not supporting the diesel company, not supporting the equipment dealer. You know, I'm going to do it because I was buying polywire and solar fencers, you know, working on that regenerative intensive rotational grazing or mob grazing or all of those kinds of things, trying to get as much stocking density out of your property as you can, the whole while trying to just heal the soil. Because at the end of the day, you can't take the money with you, you can't take the cows with you, but the legacy is the land that you leave behind. And so if you're not leaving it better than when you found it, you're just spinning your wheels. You know, if you're a row crop farmer who's just using the soil as a media to grow stuff, and then you're giving it all the amendments that it needs, you know, that you're buying from the fertilizer company or the herbicide, pesticide company, all of the, you know, chemical companies, at the end of the day, are you leaving the land better than when you found it? I mean, because there are practices out there that allow you to build soil all the while growing your row crops. A lot of times it takes a little more work, maybe an extra pass across the field, which for some people is just too much to ask. But for me, I mean, it's boots on the ground. It's observational science. That's a term that I'm using over and over and over again. Observational science. I show people pictures of you two guys, and I'm like, these guys are on a meat diet. They're like on an animal-based diet, and this is what they look like, right? They're not eating their heart-healthy bran muffin for breakfast with their frappuccino or whatever, you know. And my observation, which is therefore observational science, tells me they're onto something. And people are like, oh my gosh, you're crazy. You know. And so it's interesting because one of my beef customers is a doctor over on the Front Range. He's a huge Weston A. Price follower. And of course, so in the 1930s, we had a dentist traveling all over the world, studying people and their diets and their health and their jaw structure and their teeth and all of these things. And what he told us through observational science is eat meat and whole foods, locally sourced whole foods, and you will live longer and you will be healthier. And then we threw all of that out the window and said, meat's bad, fat's bad, eat more grains, be obese, have diabetes, die of heart disease. And so I'm just like, whoa, what? Okay. And so it's one of those things where all of this ties together. Like what I'm doing with the soil feeds the grass, that feeds the cows, that feeds people who actually care about their health and where their food comes from, who then are going to live longer, healthier lives. They're going to have less pharmaceuticals touch their systems ever because they don't need any of that crap, and that's an interesting thing about this, Dr. Sam is he's getting people off diabetes medicine. He's getting people off heart medicine from the work that he's doing by just change the way you eat. Like if you care enough about your health, I'm going to quit giving you pills. Just do this.
Mm-hmm.
Not any extra exercise, just change your diet. Like you don't have to do anything extra, right? It's just about what you consume. And you can eat as much meat as you want.
Mm-hmm.
Just do it.
Yes.
And it works. And people are getting healthy because of it. It's just like, oh, wow. I want to have a seat at the table. I want to be that guy. I want to provide that protein to the people who want it.
Yeah, I think we talked about this, or we've talked about this before, the incentives and just creating the structure of the system. There needs to be, I'm curious what you think the number is, like how many more Jason Wrichs do we need out there to make this regenerative agriculture movement really start to take form and have some substance behind it, where people are able to really lean into it and it can support the broader population? Because right now it's kind of it's tucked away in certain pockets and certain communities, and I think it's going to continue to grow in popularity, but it's not going to grow in popularity if people don't recognize the fact that we need people like yourself out there doing the work. So I'm curious what you think about in terms of adoption and getting people to really buy into wanting to participate, maybe even at, there's different levels to participate at, right? Like we participate at, supporting you, and then also, living the lifestyle of being a beef consumer. So, that's where we're playing right now. Our goal is to eventually, maybe change that. But I think that, from your perspective, I'm curious to get your take on, what the ecosystem needs to look like.
Well, and that's the thing for me is the biggest hurdle for most people to entry is their state of mind. People say, well, I can't afford to buy land to do that. I don't own any land. Mm-hmm. I lease the property that our house is on. I don't own any land. I mean, our home place is 260 acres, right? And I realized after the drought that we couldn't sustain our business in that. And so I started going door to door, essentially talking to people about, hey, would you like me to take care of your place? I see that no one's taking care of your place. We're just under 4,000 acres right now. And some of those are free. I mean, they said, you fix the fence, you take care of it and irrigate it. We don't want anything for it. You can hay it. You can do whatever you want for nothing. Just take care of it, because nobody's taking care of it and they don't want to do it. And so it's the change of mind. Like for me, it's been a blessing and a curse for me in my life. As soon as someone says, oh, you can't do that, it's like challenge accepted. And that's with everything. I mean, I was one of the youngest shift superintendents in the coal mine because no matter what, it was can-do attitude, right? Like I had guys twice my age working for me, asking me, Jace, what do we do next? Like, well, the roof is caved in. We probably need to set some timbers and call MSHA, the Mine Safety and Health Administration, and let them know we've had a roof fall, but we got to do something here. So let's do this. Let's start with, it's like eating an elephant, one bite at a time. It's the same thing with any business, right? And so, number one, it's like awareness. And that's where I come in. I don't know how many people I've helped start their direct to consumer beef business, or even just give them ideas to like, hey, try this, think about this, you can do that, you can do this. You don't have to go big, start small, build a customer base based on that, and then piggyback those on those people. Like, okay, I'll give you $50 off your next order if you refer someone else, or whatever. It's one of those things, that word of mouth advertising, you don't have to spend a bunch of money. You don't have to be a people person. Let your product sell itself. Sure, you're going to have to talk to someone to start, but then let your customer talk you up to your next customer and talk you up to your next customer, and on and on and on and on. And it's like shipping beef. We don't ship beef because of the amount of trash that it makes. I mean, because we recycle everything. I mean, we have a family of 4, and we make half a trash bag of trash a week. And that's mainly beef wrappers, because everything that we do is either in glass containers, or it's canned in glass, or we buy it in bulk and transfer it to glass. And so I refuse to ship beef. The other thing is cost. I mean, it's super expensive to ship meat overnight. But I'm missing out on a lot of market. But that's just the way that's just our business plan. Like, we won't do it. But I will deliver to the Front Range, to Denver, Colorado Springs, Boulder, whatever, once a month, right? I load 2 old dead freezers in the back of my truck, the ranch truck, and I pack it full of meat, and I make a route and meet people along the way and deliver beef for 2 reasons. Number 1, I don't have to ship it that way. But number 2, it's the face-to-face, know your rancher, shake your hand connections that I'm trying to make. I'm trying to educate people, and I'm trying to preach to them, and most of them are very receptive. I mean, they're just like, you can see just how excited and how happy and everything that they are about like what we're doing and why we're doing it, because not only are they supporting me, they're supporting their family's health as well by choosing to eat that pure beef protein, unadulterated, because there's all kinds of things you can do to beef and still get away with selling it as beef. Whereas ours, I mean, it hangs and dry ages for 14 days. They cut it up, flash freeze it, and that's it, and then it's right to your door. And so here's an interesting statistic. So 2021 in the United States, we butchered 3,800 head of beef cattle a day that were microprocessors or smaller. So you're talking 30 head a week type of processors, and that was all direct to consumer beef. So that was 3,200 head a day, which totaled like, I don't remember what the math was on it, because you figure a 5-day-a-week kill week, and it was a bunch. And that was only 2% of all beef butchered in the entire United States.
Wow.
So you're looking at that direct to consumer market, the microprocessors, all of that stuff is a drop in the bucket. So to put what you're asking into perspective of how many more regenerative guys like me, because those cattle that I told you the numbers, 3/4 of those are small feedlot fed cattle. They are not regenerative fed cattle. They live in a feedlot, right? And they're fed byproducts and whatever. And so we're a fraction of that as far as the grass-fed, grass-finished game. And so that's just gives you perspective on like how much beef is raised and butchered and then shipped out of the country, or just goes to the grocer, and that's what most people pick up. And so, then you go, when our big beef associations they work hand in hand with the row crop farmers. And so they're not going to burn any of those bridges with the the advertising that they do and the connections that they have. And so for someone to break out of that, if you're not willing to face the ridicule, can be really, really hard. I mean, I will tell you firsthand, I've had people tell me, I would not feed a grass-fed, grass-finished steak to my dog, you know, and it's just like, okay, great. I'll sell it for $10 a pound all day long, you know, to someone else, right? But some of those people have also given them a pack of ribeyes, or I've given them a pack of fillets or whatever. Like, here you go, try this. Just tell me what you think. You know, cook it the way you'd cook your whatever steak, and tell me what you think. And they're like, there's no way that was grass-fed and finished. Why do you say? Like, well, the texture was good and the flavor was good and the tenderness was good. And it's like, yeah, I mean, that's just exactly it. I mean, grass-fed is not always super lean and tough, but a lot of that also comes from how you handle your beef. Like when we butcher on farm, which some of our custom stuff that we don't sell retail, we kill on farm. So the mobile butcher comes, brings his butcher truck here. They go in the squeeze chute that they think like they're going to get a new ear tag, you know, or get a checkup. And boom, the only bad day they've had in their entire life is when they may come through the chute. They look at the butcher like, what are you doing? Bang, they're dead, bleed them out, you know, skin, gut, everything. There was no stress hormones released at all whatsoever.
Wow.
And that's huge. Then there's no bruising in a trailer either. Whereas a lot of these guys are having to travel 200 miles, you know, to a slaughter facility. And so you can imagine banging around in a trailer for 200 miles, what kind of bruising that you get on those carcasses. And that's, you know, that's one of those things where so many of our small butcher shops and abattoirs went out of business by design. The big guys, they did a press release back in the 70s saying, we will put every small packer out of business because they will not be able to compete with us.
Wow.
From 1973 to 1999, 80,000 plus small feedlots went out of business, totally due to consolidation. And all of those small butcher plants along with them. And so you look at market share, all of those communities that had 3, 4, 5 employees at the feedlot, 3, 4, 5 employees at the butcher shop, they all went out of business. And ththose small communities just dried up because there wasn't an industry there anymore. And that's all across the Midwest. You know, and it's one of those things, the more I dig into it, it's just like, and our government stood idly by, didn't enforce, you know, the Stockyards Act at all, and just let it happen. And so now you have, you know, the big meat packing plant gets sued by for price fixing for 52 point something million, and they just write a check.
Okay.
You know, and their press release says, we take no responsibility for anything of the allegations. Here's the check for 52 million to just go away. So what does that tell you? I mean, something's got to be going on. And it's just one thing after another after another. I mean, USDA regulation, if I'm going to sell something to someone and I'm going to shake their hand, I care about their health. I want to make sure that that product is wholesome because I want them to come back and buy more. If it's not good, my name is mud. Do you think the guy with the USDA code on and the packing plant cares more about my customer than I do? No, he's enforcing regulation. And that's one of those things that no matter what, I continue to educate and preach and coach about that. Like, know your rancher, know your processor, you know, educate yourself. And that way you can make wise decisions as an educated consumer in where you procure your groceries. And that's how it should be. It shouldn't be some guy in a white coat telling you, how you should or shouldn't do it, or if it's right or wrong or whatever, you should be able to go wherever you want to buy your beef, not only somewhere that's been USDA inspected.
Absolutely. So is that a regulatory issue, right? Like that there's too much red tape around getting those processing facilities up and able to, be able to be used by multiple people?
Yeah, and that's one of those things that's different state by state, because like in Texas, they have state inspectors. Whereas in Colorado, you either have custom, which is essentially uninspected, but it is overseen by the county health department, or you have USDA, which is overseen by the USDA. Last year, we passed the Animal Shares Act, which allows you to sell custom butchered meat direct to consumer as long as they are what they termed an educated consumer. So you have to explain to them, this was not butchered in a USDA facility, and just be aware of that. So you either have signage, or like on your cut sheet, it says on there, this is a non-USDA facility. But still, to sell in a restaurant, no matter what, it has to be USDA inspected. And of course, so if you have a USDA inspected facility, you have to have an office for the inspector. He or she has to have their own bathroom. You have all these certain set of protocols that then, if you're trying to build a new plant, you look at how much additional cost you have just in building the building to be able to house a USDA inspector. The other thing too that no one talks about is the offal. So the guts and the hooves and the heads and all of that stuff. Most of these big plants, it just goes in the landfill. There are parts of it that they export. There are markets for tripe in some countries. There are markets for things. Most of my consumers, they want the heart, they want the liver, they want the kidneys, they want all of that leaf fat that suspends the organs, all of that really important, super nutrient dense stuff. But the rest of it, they don't want. So when we kill on farm, I'm able to compost all of those nutrients and spread them back out on this place. Whereas otherwise at these big facilities, they go in a giant dumpster and then they go to the landfill. And so that's another one of those things, but there's USDA regulation about that as well, about how all that stuff has to be handled and how it has to be housed and all of that stuff. So then you have a whole bunch more infrastructure to look at. And so that's, for me, if you could have a butcher facility in every county or every other county all across the United States, not only would you put a whole bunch of people back to work and you could pay them a living wage, but you have so many more avenues of how to deal with all of those byproducts, all the bone, all the guts, heads, all of that stuff. Whereas now it just goes to the landfill. And so that's another thing, you kind of bring that to the conversation. Like, well, let's look at doing a new, microprocessor at 30 head a week. What else can we do with that? Can we do dog chew toys? Can we do, can we grind bone for bone meal? Do we incinerate it and use it to make bone meal fertilizer? All of these different things that you can do with all that offal, as long as you're thinking outside the box and you don't get stuck in a rut of, well, this is how everyone else does, and that's just how we'll do it.
That observational science.
Observational science. There you go. Hashtag observational science.
Yeah, Jason, I think it's so important to have conversations like this where you're telling your story, because I think the issue is that most people just aren't aware of the red tape and the M&A activity in the beef industry and all the things that you just talked about. Because when we hear someone like you tell your story, it's like, oh my God, like not only is buying meat directly from you the best thing for me nutritionally, it's also putting money directly into your pocket to allow you to build out the farm, buy more cows, and continue, just keep a really good cycle going. So that's why I think just being able to share these stories is so impactful. And I know you touched on it before, but what would you say are what are the biggest differentiators between buying a ribeye from you versus buying a ribeye from a supermarket or something that's touched by a big four processor?
Wow, there's a lot to unpack there. So number one, you have ultimate traceability. I mean, I can tell you who that calf's mom was, who that calf's dad was, what day it was born, what day it was butchered, what its ear tag number was. I mean, I can tell you the life cycle. So it spent the summers on the mountain, frolicking in the aspen groves, all of that stuff, right? Ultimate traceability. It was butchered on this date. We hung for 14 days. Whereas oftentimes in those big facilities, the calf was born on a small farm like mine, let's say. It lives with its mom till it's 6, 7, 8 months old. It's weaned. It goes to a preconditioning facility, which is a big feedlot, or maybe to go to wheatgrass or something under a wheatgrass pivot. Gets preconditioned. Essentially, its immunity needs to get built up before it goes to a feedlot. Then it goes into a feedlot and it's fed a total mixed ration, which is, the cheapest commodities that you can find. You need something for a protein, something for an energy, and then you'll have a mineral supplement mixed in there as well. And now they're developing a lot of new feed stimulants, ionophores and stuff like that they're giving that helps them gain weight faster. And then they're also doing hormone implants, which are little pellets of hormone that they stick under the skin in their ears, so they gain weight. And steers and heifers both, they all get hormones when they go to the feedlot in a conventional situation. Oftentimes you have some that are feeding for specific markets that are not implanted and have never had antibiotics, but most just go into a conventional commingled feedlot. And then they're fed out, to the point where their bone structure oftentimes has a hard time holding up the weight that they've gained, like a super obese human, and the joints and whatnot suffer. Load them on a truck, haul them to a kill facility where they're, they go through, they're butchered, all of that stuff. And in the big facilities, because they're going through there so fast, every person in there makes one cut. So you have like one person jerks the hide off, one person, does a partial gut, takes certain organs out, another person does the final gut, another person cuts the feet off, another person does a partial cut. I mean, it's like a giant machine, and they're packed in there like a giant manufacturing facility. And they go all the way through there, they go to chill. And because they're moving so many through there, oftentimes they don't get that dry age time. They're just moving them right through. So by the time they get cooled, they may go right to the cut floor. They get cut into either primals or final cuts, boxed beef, and they go out the door. Whereas for us, we do a minimum of 14 age dry age. And the purpose of dry aging is you let the bacteria and the enzymes that's naturally present in the meat start to break down the tissues to make it more tender and more flavorful. And so that's one of those things where the longer you dry age it, the more tender it is, but the less your yield is, because that dry skin on the meat gets thicker and thicker and thicker as the outside layers of those carcasses essentially dehydrate. That's why it's called dry aging, because they're drying down. And so some people want it aged for longer, and that's why we do our cost based on a wet hanging weight. So as soon as you split that animal in half, that's when you weigh it, and that's what the cost is. Because if you age longer than that, then your yield is going to be a lot less, because there's going to be a lot more dry trim to trim off. And so back to the conventionally raised beef. When they're cut into primals, like you'll have a whole loin group, or you'll have a whole rib group, or a whole shoulder group, they go to the final destination and they cut them into whatever your individual steaks are. Well, they need to sell them, within 72 to 96 hours, oftentimes, if they're just raw, if they haven't had anything done to them. You'll see sometimes in those styrofoam trays, they have like a little diaper in the bottom to absorb the liquids that's oozing out of them. And then oftentimes, if you look at like a package, like a large package of ground beef, it'll be really pink and pretty on the top, and you dig into it and there's like a layer of brown. And people are like, well, what's going on with that? Like, what? So the part you would figure, the part that you could see would be brown also, right? Because it's right there near the top. Well, as some people know, is if you take a little salt or nitric acid or something and give it a little, it stays pink longer because it stops the oxidation process. Because that's what's happening, is the browning is just simply oxidation. It's breaking down further, kind of turning an off color. And there are a lot of butcher secrets that you can do. One thing that an old butcher that I know who used to work at a small grocery store, they would take a lot of their older steaks and debone them, trim all the fat off of them, and sometimes not trim all the fat. And then they would grind those with a little bit of ice, because the super cold pinks it up. And then you get a little bit more weight. It's just water weight. It's ground with ice. And so then you repackage that in your case as ground beef. And so most consumers, if you're making patties and throwing them on the grill, okay, we started as a 1/4 pound patty, and then we have this little charcoal briquette looking thing by the time all the water cooks out of them. But that's another little butcher trick that they would do. It was just a standard practice. Whereas for us, it's cut up and then frozen. So there's no adultering that can happen in between the cut up and the frozen, and that's when you receive it. So it's either cryovac sealed in clear plastic, or it is wrapped in plastic and then white butcher paper wrapped, depending on what butcher we use and also what the customer preference is.
It's just a different level of customization, honestly. Even just like you said, being able to trace back the lineage, how they were raised, not touching the cow with any type of antibiotics. And then if we have a relationship, if you know that I like my ribeyes or strips cut to a certain level of thickness, I know you said you'll make sure that all happens. It's just totally different. And even just to be able to say, hey, Jason, is this cow grass-fed, grass-finished? Whereas if I'm buying something at a grocery store that I think is grass-fed, I actually don't know what it's finished on. I think you said when we first met that there's certain loopholes where you can have a grass-fed labeling, right? But you could actually finish it on like candy or just other garbage or processed crap that they give the cow. Is that correct?
Yeah. So you can be certified grass-fed and still finish on a total mixed ration for a certain amount of time based on your level of certification. And so that's why it's so important. I mean, it's so important to know your rancher. That's the end game, right? But if you don't, the label needs to say grass-fed, grass-finished. Because that's another thing too, is I see a lot of grass-fed beef labeled as grass-fed beef. And then you start looking at their practices and you look at pictures of their operations and you're like, that looks like a total mixed ration that they're feeding out in this field, in this feed trough, and so then you dig a little deeper and they talk about feeding, bakery waste or cotton seed or soybean meal or distillers grains, because if you're near an industry, you can source a lot of cheap feedstuffs. Like, for instance, I was talking to one of my, actually, I guess she was doing a telephone interview for me about soil health. And she was telling me where they had a lot of cold potatoes that they hauled up to a cattle rancher in Kansas, and he's feeding potatoes to his cows out in the pasture. So really, you could still get away with a label that says pasture raised, but you're feeding them potatoes in the pasture, because technically you are pasture raising them, but they're eating potatoes also. And so that's one of those things. And then you look at like USDA labeling, organic, grass-fed, grass-finished, all natural, never ever. there all of these labeling, and it's so confusing because it's all about marketing. It's all marketing ploys, and some of it's pretty important. And I think it was good when they started it, but so many industrious folks chasing the dollar use that labeling to their advantage, and they aren't afraid to capitalize on it.
Mm.
Jason, I think I remember speaking with you about this before, but Whole Foods, some of their beef, is it all considered local? Like I remember you saying that there was a law that recently was passed that now they can import from Brazil.
So yeah, that's another great topic. Thank you for bringing that up. It's called the Cool Act.
Mm.
So they repealed the Cool
How
Act.
do you spell that? Is it K?
COOL, and it stands for Country of Origin Labeling.
Okay.
So a good friend of mine who's over in Saguache, Colorado, was a grass-fed, grass-finished, all natural. He was the first guy in the state of Colorado that I know of who started doing the Allen Savory style intensive rotational grazing. And he was the #1 grass-fed, grass-finished producer selling to Whole Foods. And about 45 days after Congress repealed the Cool Act, his purchaser for Whole Foods sent him a letter saying, "We have found an opportunity to source our beef protein for a 45% discount of what your price point is. Would you be willing to renegotiate your contract with us?" And of course, you guys are in business, right? And so whatever you do, if a customer comes and says, "Hey, I can get the same service for 45% less than what you're charging me," what do? Well, come to find out, they're importing grass-fed, grass-finished, labeled beef from out of country. And of course, so he essentially had to redesign his entire business. But yeah, that's simply and so we've been pushing to try and get it reinstated. But the problem is when your lobbying dollars are stuffing dollars in your representatives and senators' pockets to keep doing what they're doing, because if you look at the big packers and how many feedlots they own in other countries that have figured out the supply chain that they can bring their own cheap cattle in from their home country of Brazil and bring them into Mexico and just put them there for 30 days to then consider them Mexican beef, which qualifies them to be imported through the North America Free Trade Agreement in here as lean beef, and then butchered here for cheap, for nothing. It makes good business sense. And so why would we support American ranchers when the packers own our representatives and senators and USDA and every other governmental organization and keep padding their pockets instead of promoting American beef? And that's what's happening. I mean, Mike Calcrate can tell you all about it because he's lived it. He was a cattle producer, he was a feedlot owner. I mean, and that guy has lived it. I mean, he's in his 70s now, so he's been there, done that. And he can give you the whole history on when it started to fall apart because he's been along for the ride. And it's just one of those things where it's disgusting. If it was any other business, someone would have been strung up over it. You know what I mean? It's sickening. But that's why we do what we do. That's why we sell direct to consumer. I'm going to circumvent as much of that BS as I can. I'm going to focus on plant health and soil health and animal health and human health, and try not to invest too much energy in the BS of the bureaucracy of it.
Yeah, it seems like the only way to be in trying to limit your dependencies in an industry where it's very easy to fall dependent on these big concentrated bottlenecks in the system, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's so we've had a big drought in all parts of the United States. So we sold half of our cow herd again, and a lot of people did. And so then you look at cattle facts and you look at market analysts, and they're like, it'll be great for cow calf producers because cow numbers are down, and hold on and keep doing what you're doing. It's going to get better, and calf prices will be better. And I'm saying, so what you're saying is keep starving for another year in hopes that you can get ahead next year? No thanks. I'm going to save more calves to feed out myself, to sell direct to consumer, because those guys are making money hand over fist, and they're not reinvesting in the local economy. They're exporting it back to the CEOs and the CFOs and whatever country that they live in.
Yeah, we talked about this a little bit, I think, previously, but it really seems like there's a lot of misalignments of interest across the board in the food system. And I'm curious to get your take on where you see some of those affecting you and your operation specifically. Like, I know I think one of the statistics is 65% of the corn and soy that's grown on monoculture is fed back into the conventional beef system. That seems like a massive misalignment of interest when you're trying to create healthy food and also create a system that's best for the environment. So is there anything else that you would touch on that point? That's a loaded gun question, isn't it?
Yeah, well, because I want to share this podcast with a lot of friends of mine who are heavily involved in row crop agriculture, I will say that, from about the 70s on, we have taught those folks that that's the only way to live, right? Mm-hmm. Like, get bigger equipment, lease more acres. That's the only way that you can survive. Where what the reality is the business model of the 1940s and 50s small farm. Let's say a section, as a full size of your operation, was way more profitable for many reasons. Number one, you're not paying interest on big, shiny equipment. Number two, you were typically much more diversified. And so you weren't just leaning on one monocultural crop for your entire whatever. And because you were more diverse, you didn't have the pest pressure that you do now, which requires you to spray every single thing to kill every single thing that you can to grow that monocrop. And so in getting bigger, the government figured out that if you're relying on monocrop, you're going to have to help those farmers because they may have crop failure. And so we're going to have to do something to keep them getting bigger. And that's where your subsidies and your insurance come in. And so that then again is another crutch or another thing that a lot of people, that's what they rely on. And if you know it's there, then you're willing to put in that crop that might fail. Whereas if it's your dollars and you're not going to get them back no matter what, if you're farming in marginal land, I sure as heck wouldn't put that expensive seed in the ground and buy expensive fertilizer and expensive herbicide and pesticide to spray on it and burn all that diesel going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth over it. I just wouldn't do it. And that's one of those things that I see a lot. And then you talk to them about, well, let's plant this up back in perennial grasses, like what was here before the white man came and started messing it up. let's look at how well cattle can do, like locally adapted cattle, how well they can do on the grass if you're managing it like the bison would have, as far as high stocking density for short duration and long rest. Just exactly what Alan Savory's taught us all to do, and all of his books say to do. But then they wouldn't have their tractor time. They wouldn't have their 32 row planter, and they wouldn't have their 40-foot combine head and all of that stuff. And so, and it's a way of life for them as well. And so, like I said about the consumers, as far as it's just a change of mind and new people wanting to get into regenerative ag, it's just a change of mind. And that's oftentimes the hardest part, the biggest hurdle to get over, is just that change of perspective.
Do you see some of these changes in commodity prices, like ammonia, for instance, creating more pressure on farmers who aren't doing what you're doing and are doing what, say, your friend who's more reliant on the tractor and row cropping model?
It'd have to. I mean, because even at the end of the day, there's still dollars and cents. It's inputs and outputs. The flip side of that is, because they're not going to be fertilizing as much, or they won't be able to afford to fertilize as much, then their commodity price in their grain is going to be that much higher. So that's the thing, that it's supply and demand. Okay, well, we're not going to fertilize, and we're going to settle for a 120 bushel crop versus a 250 bushel crop. And because we know we're going to get a third again, or even double the price for it at the elevator. Another thing with the industrial pharmaceutical food complex is just fuel consumption. That's the thing that I talk to people about, is like, okay, so the fuel to plow, the fuel to disc, the fuel to roller harrow, the fuel to level, the fuel to plant, the fuel to cultivate, the fuel to spray, the fuel to harvest, the fuel to haul it to the elevator, the fuel in the dryer to dry it because it was too wet when you harvested it, the fuel to haul it to the feedlot or whatever it is, the fuel to grind it, the fuel to feed it, the fuel to scrape the manure out of the corrals, the fuel to spread the manure. I mean, just from a fuel standpoint, oh my goodness. Wow. And that has real cost. And that's just the thing for me, is like, I have tractors. I like tractors. I love tractors. As a matter of fact, my big tractor started running rough, and I'm going to have to figure out what's wrong with it. And but on the same token, boy, if I didn't have to start the tractor, boy, that would be nice, because they're noisy and they use oil and they use fuel and they use hydraulic oil. It's one of those things where if I could completely get away from it and just graze standing forage all the time, I would be so happy. Unfortunately, we get quite a bit of snow, and there are at least probably 45 days out of the year that I have to feed some sort of supplemental forage. So, but yeah, so I mean, to go back to your question of like, is it going to change that? It's going to change it somehow. And really the best thing we can do is convince the consumers to put down the Doritos, and plant a garden. Because really, just like anything, it's the consumers decide with their dollar what lives and what dies.
Yes.
And so people wandering around, waddling on the interior aisles of the grocery store, huffing and puffing on their oxygen, filling their cart with garbage, they're going to continue to do it. And there's nothing that I can say that's going to help them. And that's the other thing too, is you look at the pharmaceutical side of it and the physician side of it, like they have standard protocols, and they have to have pretty words for saying a carbohydrate restricted diet is what we recommend for you. You know, that's the verbiage that they're able to start using, because if they're saying carnivore diet or anything like that, by golly, they can lose their license, because that's not an accepted practice. And and when you look at that, you're like, we need to do something different.
Yeah, we've spoken to a number of doctors that have gotten their patients on various degrees of carnivore, low carb, ketogenic approaches, primary red meat diets, and have gotten hundreds of patients off insulin and cured chronic diseases and ulcerative colitis and IBS, and they're still getting persecuted by their fellow doctors because it's not part of the standard narrative, even though they're essentially curing these diseases that are supposed to be uncurable and treating their food like their medicine. I mean, Clemenza and I talk about this all the time, Jason, where there's almost like two steps to it, where it's like step one, you have your own experience with the diet, which I had and Clemenza had, where we both got healthier eating meat. And then you take it a step further. You're like, oh, well, where am I sourcing my meat? Do I know my farmer? Do I know what the cow's actually finished on? And that's where these relationships come into play. So it's interesting where it's like, it kind of starts from this selfish desire to improve your own health. And then you take it a step further and you want to build a relationship with your farmer.
Well, and that plays right into Bitcoin. It's the same thing. You're like, oh, what is this? Oh, yes, I am in. It's the same kind of thing, but you have to have that inquiring minds want to know, like, what's the source of the seed? Let's go, and you gather up your tribe with you and you try and educate as many people and take them with you as you can, because you see what's happening, and it's like, okay, what we're doing as the Western diet, which is sickening to say, but that's what it's called. I mean, you go to any country, countries in Africa where like they'll sell their goats and their goat milk so they can go buy Doritos. It's insane. You're just like, huh? Or so they can go out to eat at McDonald's. You're like, no, that's backwards. Don't do it. But they're doing it, and it's the same thing, for us. I mean, we're fortunate we have a local raw dairy. We can get raw milk, cream, yogurt, kefir, and butter. I mean, it's like the real deal, right? And of course, we raise our own beef. So we have lots of friends that have chickens, and so we can get fresh farm eggs. And I mean, you crack a store-bought egg and you look at the yolk and the size of the yolk and the color and the texture versus a home-raised egg, you're like, oh my God, I don't even know why I was eating this. Like, what is this? This doesn't even look like an egg, and so we're blessed to have that. I mean, the seasonality of fruit, we have organic orchards and berry farms and gardens and all that stuff that we can source so much of our food locally. And you see it in our health. I mean, my wife got into a pretty good health kick with our diet, and we've been working really hard to try and cook as many home cooked meals as we can, and then making leftovers to where you have good lunches for the next day for her to take to work and for me to have here at the ranch. And you just feel so much better, and you're not doing any more exercise, but you're losing weight.
Yes.
And everyone's just like, what are you doing different? I'm like, I'm eating meat. Put the bag of chips down and cook yourself a steak or a hamburger patty or whatever it needs to be. Eat some meat and some real animal fat. Put all the carbs away because you don't need them. Sure. I mean, we have a couple of bakeries that grind their own flour, and I love bread. I love bread. Yeah. So I'll splurge a little bit, but it's one of those things where it's real food. I mean, it's locally sourced real food, and it's just fantastic.
And the quality of that matters too, right? Like if you're eating Subway bread, it's not even considered bread, right? But if it's up the street from someone who's got great grain and they're doing everything else right, and it's fermented sourdough or whatever it is, it makes a difference. And
yeah,
if you're eating the high quality stuff, you can have a little bit of leeway there, obviously, right?
Right. And the other thing too is if you look at naturally cured grains. So grains that are allowed to mature on the stem, because almost all of the wheat in this country is artificially matured. So they go spray the entire fields with Roundup. They would spray the entire fields with glyphosate so they can harvest it all together. So there's no green seeds and there's no live weeds. So it can go right in the bin. And you can't tell me that that weed killer isn't in that wheat when it goes to the mill to be ground into flour. Now you know why they started bleaching the ever living you know what out of it, to try and get all the garbage out of it and all of the nutrients before they started making Wonder Bread. You know, it's one of those things where if people knew that you had 64-foot booms spraying weed killer on their grains immediately before, well, it's 7 days before they're harvested, and that's what you're eating, conventionally raised wheat, that's how it's artificially hardened. And that's just standard protocol, standard practice.
That's this is a topic that I've gotten familiar with over the past few days, and it's one that I think is completely understated and not talked about enough, with the glyphosate being sprayed on basically everything, and being it's water soluble, so it doesn't go away.
Yeah, and so you have a big rain event, it goes right in the soil, runs off in the river. It's one of those, I mean, it's one of those things that nobody's talking about that. You know, I was watching a podcast or listening to a podcast of a conventional farmer. He's talking about how hard he's going to be hit on because of what chemical costs are and because of what fertilizer costs are. And I'm listening to this conversation and I'm thinking to myself, so why are you using it? You know? And then he talks about spraying his pastures when there's cows in there to kill the weeds just in his pastures. And so I'm listening to that. I was like, is this standard practice? So the interviewer chimes in and says, yeah, you know, this is the concoction of chemicals that I'm using that I've found really effective to kill this weed or that weed. What I've found is all those weeds are all mining for nutrients. Your pastures are deficient in this weed grows. Your pasture is deficient in this weed grows. If your pasture is deficient in this weed grows. So you don't have to do a soil analysis. You're like, oh, well, I've got plantain, or I've got chicory, or I've got spotted knapweed, or I've got whatever. It's because your soil is deficient in some sort of micro and macronutrients. Amend your soil. Like, how about let's put some organic chicken litter. We have a couple of egg laying facilities out here on Fruitland Mesa. Every 6 to 9 months, they're cleaning them out, and they got to do something with that organic chicken manure. By golly, let's spread it on my fields. Let's build soil. Let's feed plants. And that stuff is fantastic. And it's way cheaper than any chemical fertilizer, which I wouldn't use anyways, because why spend money on a completely man-made or mined chemical, which isn't present in the soil in that form anyways, when you can take a biological like sawdust and chicken manure and spilled feed and spread that on your fields and get way better, longer lasting, more stable results. And so it's like you go back to that observational science. Like, let's look at what's growing in the pasture and let's do something different and see if we can get a different outcome. Where these guys that just spray the same stuff over and over and over again, it's like you must have a good job in town to pay for all the money you spend on chemicals unnecessarily.
Yeah.
The other thing too is if your cows won't eat it, maybe you need a few goats, because goats eat all of those weeds. They prefer those weeds over the grass. So as opposed to spraying chemicals, go to the sale barn, get a few goats, let them eat those weeds, and then take them back to the sale barn, you know, versus sitting out there on your ATV or UTV or tractor spraying weeds. But then there you go. It's a change of mind, change of state of mind, change of priority. And oftentimes that's the hardest thing to do.
Well, I think conversations like these are so valuable in doing that. And, Salazzo and I are just starting to get more and more engaged with people like yourself. And it's been fantastic being able to learn from you and others and just learn from your experiences. But I think it's going to obviously be a lot more work from everyone who's just getting started to having been doing it for decades. Like, everyone's got to kind of grab an oar. So it's exciting to see that there's an opportunity here to really make a big impact. I think, you're just a fantastic role model for people to be following.
Well, I really appreciate that, and that's the thing for me is I enjoy talking to people. My wife hates going to the grocery store with me because I run into everyone and I want to talk about whatever we have going on. She's like, oh my gosh, there's such and such. I'm going to go the other direction because she knows I'm going to visit with them for who knows how long. But like you said, it's having that conversation, starting that conversation, introducing myself. This is what I do and this is why we do it. And they're like, wow, we didn't know that people were even doing that. We just see on the news about how terrible confinement feedlots are and packing facilities and how cows are killing the environment, and all of that stuff. And I'm like, I'd love for you to come out and see what we do and talk to you more about what we're doing. As a matter of fact, next week I'm going to go. Our Black Mesa Cattle Women's put on like an ag day thing, and I'm going to go talk about bees because we also have an apiary and I keep bees, and so that way I can talk to kids about bees and the importance of bees. And of course, I'm also going to do a stick for grass-fed, grass-finished beef, and we'll see how that goes because the cattle women, they don't do grass-fed, grass-finished beef.
I mean, does it get any better than putting a little raw local honey on top of your ribeye? It's like the most decadent, delicious combination you could ever think of.
We did some beef ribs that my wife made, like a homemade little honey glaze. Oh my word, it was unbelievable.
I think I followed you like 2 days before you posted that, and I immediately DM'd you and said, dude, can you please just send me this recipe? I know we don't know each other, but that looks freaking phenomenal.
Oh, and it was and that's one of those things where I have customers that are like, what am I going to do with beef ribs? It's like, what can't you do with them? I mean, you could boil them, right? And then put them on the smoker if that's what you want to do. You can do like we did and just put them in the La Crusade in the oven, put our little homemade rub on them and cook them. And oh, it was so good. Oh my goodness. And then the dogs got a treat because they got rib bones for treats after that. And so, I mean, it was a win-win for everybody.
That's huge.
Yeah, we're gonna have to have some type of a Meat Mafia meetup at some point, and we're gonna have to break out the beef rib recipes. We're gonna do it all, I think.
Sounds fantastic.
You
don't have to twist my arm.
Sorry, what'd you say, Clemenza?
I was saying we got to do it soon. I'm already getting hungry over here just thinking about it. We can't do these podcasts late at night and start talking about beef ribs and honey. That's a recipe for disaster for me.
For sure. Well, I'm picking up another beef and doing a big beef delivery tomorrow. So I might, have to convince one of my customers to let me take a package of those beef ribs home.
Let's do it. Love it.
Well, this is awesome, Jason. Thank you so much for coming on, having the conversation. I know I literally have like 4 pages of notes because I was just taking notes on everything you were saying. So thank you so much. We will definitely would love to come out to the farm and meet you, and you can show us the ropes because we need as much help as we can get. But we will definitely love to have you back on the podcast sometime soon.
Yeah, that sounds great. I mean, this is the way that I'm able to reach more people. And I just love doing it. And then the feedback that I get, when I was out on the way to the Front Range and back, I listened to every single podcast that you guys have done. And you guys are doing fantastic work. And all of your interviewees are top notch. And it's one of those things, everyone is experts in their field. And it's just The other thing too that I have to say is your guys' level of accuracy, because I fact check so many podcasts. Your guys' level of accuracy has been fantastic. It is probably the very best of any of the podcasts that I listen to regularly. And I super, super, super appreciate that, because you guys are freaking killing it.
Oh, we really appreciate that. That means a lot. I mean, we try to hold ourselves to that high standard. So that means a lot. Well, perfect. This has been amazing. Let's leave it at that. And also, I think as tradition, you're officially a member of the Meat Mafia. So do with that as you will. You can tell.
Fantastic.
No.
I'm gonna have to go have shirts made now.
Exactly. Exactly. All right. Take care, Jason.
Thanks,
Yep.
Jason.
Thank you, guys.
Talk to you soon.